Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era often painted with broad, romantic strokes, the age of the medieval knight. You've seen the movies, read the tales, shining armor, noble quests, damsels in distress, grand castles, and epic battles where heroes, seemingly impervious to harm, valiantly defend the weak. You picture a knight, perhaps a Lancelot or King Arthur himself, sitting astride a magnificent destrier, pennant flapping in the wind, off to slay a dragon or rescue a kingdom. It's all very cinematic, isn't it? Very Hollywood. But here's the reality check, the kind of blunt truth that would make a medieval stable boy snicker. You probably wouldn't have survived 5 minutes in their world. Seriously. Forget your climate controlled homes, your germ killing hand sanitizers, your pain relievers. This was a world of mud, disease, brutal cold, searing heat, and an ever present pungent aroma of, well, everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself not on a valiant steed, but perhaps shivering in a drafty, damp chamber, the morning chill biting at your exposed skin. The dream of chivalry, that gleaming ideal, quickly dissolves into a harsh reality when you consider the sheer, unglamorous grind of daily medieval existence. You've envisioned yourself as a brave knight, a figure of honor and might, but the reality is far from the illuminated manuscripts. Your life is not a sequence of grand tournaments and heroic rescues. It's a constant negotiation with discomfort, a never-ending battle against the elements, and a stark reminder that glory often comes coated in grime. The image of the knight, sculpted in tales and art, often focuses on the pinnacle of their existence, the battlefield, the joust, the moment of triumph. But what about the other 99% of their lives? What about the mundane, the miserable, the truly terrible aspects that these romanticized narratives conveniently omit? You imagine a life of leisure in a grand castle, perhaps a spot of falconry, a game of chess, followed by a hearty feast. Instead, your castle, while perhaps imposing from the outside, is cold, poorly lit, and riddled with draughts. The luxury of a private chamber means you might share it with only a handful of squires and servants, the smoke from the central hearth doing more to irritate your lungs than warm the stone. Your bed, if you're lucky enough to have one that isn't just a straw pallet, is likely infested with fleas and other unseen horrors. The concept of personal hygiene as we know it simply doesn't exist. You might get a bath a few times a year, in water that's been heated over a laboriously tended fire, probably shared with several other people. The notion of a daily shower. A fantastical absurdity. You wake up with the residual stench of last night's meal, the lingering odor of unwashed bodies, and the ever-present earthy smell of the castle grounds, a fragrant cocktail of human and animal waste. And speaking of hygiene, or the severe lack thereof, let's talk about disease. You're living in a world where a minor cut can quickly become a death sentence, where a common cold can escalate into pneumonia, and where the Black Death wiped out a third of the population with terrifying efficiency. You don't have antibiotics, vaccines, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. The castle's moat, often a picturesque feature in modern retellings, was more often a stagnant, disease-ridden cesspool, doubling as a convenient, albeit foul, waste disposal system. You drink water that's almost certainly contaminated, eat food that's been handled without any modern sanitation practices, and share living spaces with countless insects and rodents, all carrying their own microscopic dangers. A simple toothache that could mean days of excruciating pain, leading to infection and potentially your demise. Historians still debate the exact impact of chronic parasitic infections on medieval populations. But suffice it to say, your digestive system would be in a constant state of rebellion. Imagine the constant low level discomfort, the recurring fevers, the energy sapping infections that would be your constant companions. Your body, far from being a finely tuned machine of combat, would be a biological battleground, constantly fighting off invisible enemies. Let's move to the wardrobe, shall we? You picture yourself in gleaming, polished armor, perhaps a stylish tunic beneath. The reality is far less glamorous. Your clothes are likely made of coarse wool or linen, scratchy against your skin, and rarely washed. These garments would absorb sweat, dirt, and the various odors of your daily life, creating a formidable olfactory aura. Layering was key to staying warm in drafty castles and on cold campaigns. So you're perpetually bundled in heavy, itchy fabrics. The armor itself. We'll get to its true horrors later, but for now, imagine simply getting dressed. No zippers, no buttons in the modern sense, just laces, strap, and buckles. It's a laborious process, often requiring assistance, and once you're in it, movement is restricted, ventilation is non existent, and the weight is a constant burden. You're not just wearing clothes, you're living in them, day in and day out, accumulating layers of grime and wear. And the shoes, forget ergonomic designs. Your feet would be encased in stiff leather, offering little comfort or support, leading to blisters, sores, and probably a perpetual ache. It's no wonder medieval art often depicts people barefoot, even if it was just for a moment of relief. Beyond the physical discomfort, consider the mental toll. Your world is incredibly small. Travel is slow, dangerous, and expensive. News travels at the pace of a horse. Your understanding of the world is limited to your immediate surroundings and the occasional tales from passing travelers or returning crusaders, often embellished to the point of fantasy. There's no internet, no books for casual reading, no radio or television for entertainment. Your leisure activities are rudimentary, perhaps a game of dice, a crude form of chess, or listening to a minstrel if you're fortunate enough to have one pass through. The lack of intellectual stimulation, the sheer monotony of daily life, would be mind numbing for someone accustomed to the constant flow of information and entertainment in the modern world. You would spend countless hours simply existing, waiting for the next meal, the next training session, the next command. The concept of free time, as we understand it, a period for personal pursuits and relaxation, is largely alien. Your time is dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of your lord. And if you think your modern day office politics are bad, try navigating the medieval court. Loyalty is a fluid concept. Alliances shift like desert sands, and a perceived slight can lead to your downfall or even your death. You're not just a warrior, you're a political pawn, a piece in a much larger game of power and influence. Your fate often rests on the whims of your lord, his temperament, his ambition, and his rivalries. One wrong word, one misstep, and your status, your lands, and even your life could be forfeit. This isn't a world of legal contracts and due process. It's a world where might often makes right, and where justice is often dispensed by the powerful, not necessarily the fair. The constant need to maintain favor, to avoid offending those above you, and to subtly undermine your rivals would be an exhausting, nerve-wracking exercise. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that your security is entirely dependent on the fluctuating moods and alliances of others. Perhaps you cling to the image of the knight as a chivalrous protector, a beacon of justice in a dark age. While the ideals of chivalry were indeed espoused, Their practical application was, shall we say, selective. Chivalry was a code for nobles, largely applied to other nobles, peasants, commoners, and often even women were outside its protective umbrella. You might be sworn to protect the innocent, but the innocent often didn't include the local villagers whose crop you plundered during a campaign, or whose daughters you might have, shall we say, persuaded. The realities of warfare often superseded any high minded ideals. Burning villages, slaughtering non combatants, and taking prisoners for ransom were not uncommon practices. The moral compass of the medieval knight, while perhaps pointing north in theory, often wobbled wildly in practice, guided more by pragmatism and self interest than by pure virtue. Academics still debate the extent to which chivalric ideals truly influence behavior versus serving as a post hoc justification for violence. Was it a genuine moral code, or simply a very effective PR campaign for the warrior elite? Finally, consider the future, or the lack thereof. Your life expectancy is brutally short. A knight might live to see his 40s or 50s if he's incredibly lucky and avoids both battle and disease. Most wouldn't. The constant exposure to violence, the unsanitary conditions, and the primitive medical care meant that early death was a constant specter. You wouldn't be planning for retirement, saving for your kids' college funds, or even thinking about what you do next year. Your focus would be on survival, day by day, campaign by campaign. The concept of a comfortable old age was a luxury reserved for very few. You would live with the constant awareness that your life could be snuffed out at any moment by a stray arrow, a festering wound, or a sudden fever. This pervasive sense of precarity, the understanding that your existence was fragile and fleeting, would undoubtedly color every moment, making even the simplest pleasures feel precious, and the discomforts feel all the more burdensome. It's a stark contrast to our modern obsession with longevity and future planning. For the medieval knight, the future was less a roadmap and more a whispered prayer. Last night, we barely scratched the surface of the medieval knight's less than glamorous existence, touching on the pervasive grime and the ever present threat of disease. Tonight, let's descend deeper into the everyday realities, because if you thought just being alive was rough, imagine trying to thrive, or even merely survive, in an era where basic comforts were practically non existent. You might still be picturing a knight, perhaps Sir Reginald the Resplendent, enjoying a grand feast, goblet in hand, surrounded by roasted meats and fine wines. Let me tell you, Sir Reginald likely spent more time with an empty belly than a full one, and his fine wine was probably closer to glorified vinegar, if he was lucky enough to get any at all. Consider the daily grind, not of battle, but of mere sustenance. Your diet as a knight, while ostensibly better than that of a common peasant, was far from what you'd call balanced or consistently satisfying. Sure, when you were at the Lord's castle, there might be feasts, lavish affairs with roasted boar, venison, and a variety of fowl, but these were special occasions, often tied to religious festivals, victories, or important visitors. They weren't your everyday meal. On a typical day, you'd be eating a lot of bread, probably made from coarsely ground grains, dense and hard, often stale. Vegetables would be seasonal and limited, mostly root vegetables and legumes like peas and beans. Meat, while a staple for the nobility, was often salted or smoked to preserve it, which drastically altered its texture and flavor, making it incredibly tough and often overly salty. Fresh meat was a luxury, usually consumed immediately after a hunt or slaughter. And let's not forget the sheer monotony. Imagine eating almost the exact same limited range of foods, day in and day out, for weeks on end. Your taste buds, accustomed to the dizzying array of flavors and cuisines available today, would be in a constant state of mild revolt. Spices were incredibly expensive, rare luxuries, meaning most food was bland by modern standards, flavored only with salt or common herbs grown locally. Forget about that. Morning coffee or a refreshing soda. Your primary beverages would be ale or cider, even for children, because water was often unsafe to drink. These drinks were weak, fermented, and provided some calories and a safer alternative to direct water sources. But constant mild intoxication was a very real side effect for many. You'd be perpetually in a state of slightly buzzed, if not outright drunk, which probably explains some of the more spirited medieval decision making. Historians still debate the true level of daily alcohol consumption, but it's safe to say it was significantly higher than today, and not for recreational purposes, but out of necessity. Then there's the issue of hunger. While theoretically, a knight was well fed, campaigns and sieges could quickly change that. Imagine being on campaign, miles from any supply lines, relying on whatever you could forage or plunder. You might go days with minimal food, your stomach growling, your energy levels plummeting. Siege warfare was particularly brutal, not just for the besieged, but for the besiegers. You're camped outside a castle, often for months, enduring the elements and waiting for the defenders to starve. But what about you? Your own supplies dwindle, morale drops, and the risk of disease in crowded, unsanitary camps skyrockets. The idea of a balanced meal or calorie intake was completely alien. You ate when there was food, and you made do when there wasn't. Your body would be a testament to resilience, but also to constant nutritional deficiencies, likely leading to chronic fatigue, weak bones, and a host of other health issues we now easily prevent with a multivitamin. Beyond the plate, let's talk about the domestic side of a knight's life when he wasn't charging into battle or defending a castle. You might envision days spent polishing your armor, practicing with your sword, and perhaps engaging in a bit of courtly love. While training was indeed a crucial part of a knight's existence, it was far from glamorous. It was brutal, repetitive, and often injury inducing. You'd spend hours swinging heavy swords, practicing maneuvers in cumbersome armor, enduring the scorching sun or freezing rain. There were no climate controlled gyms, no padded mats, just dirt, sweat, and the very real risk of a sprain, a broken bone, or a nasty cut from a dull practice weapon. Remember, medieval medicine. So, any injury, no matter how minor, carried a significant risk of infection or permanent disability. And it wasn't just about fighting. A knight's duties extended far beyond the battlefield. You were a manager, a local administrator, a judge, and a law enforcer, all rolled into one. If you were a landed knight, you were responsible for the peasants on your lands. This meant settling disputes, collecting rents, ensuring agricultural productivity, and maintaining order. Imagine trying to mediate a feud between two stubborn farmers about a stray pig, or trying to collect taxes from a village reeling from a bad harvest, all while dealing with your own lord's incessant demands. There was no clear distinction between your military role and your administrative one. They were deeply intertwined. You might spend your morning inspecting the harvest and your afternoon drilling your men at arms. It was a constant juggling act, requiring not just physical strength but also a surprising amount of patience and political acumen. Then there's the utter boredom of peacetime. You've been trained since boyhood for war, for combat, for the thrill of the charge. But war wasn't a constant state. There were long periods of relative peace. How do you, a highly trained and often restless warrior, fill your days? Life in a medieval castle, for all its imposing grandeur, could be incredibly dull. There were no streaming services, no video games, no bustling cities with endless distractions. You might hunt if game was plentiful and your lord permitted. You might practice your skills in the training yard. But the sheer monotony, the slow passage of time, must have been soul-crushing for many. This is perhaps why jousting and tournaments became so popular. They offered a rare opportunity for excitement, glory, and a chance to test your skills in a relatively controlled environment. It was a way to let off steam, to prove your worth, and to escape the relentless tedium. Imagine the psychological impact of living in a world of such limited stimuli, where your primary purpose was often dormant. Perhaps that's why feuds and petty squabbles flared up so easily. Anything to break the monotony. And let's talk about that gleaming armor you picture. Forget its protective qualities for a moment and consider it as a daily imposition. This wasn't some lightweight, ergonomic, modern, tactical gear. This was hundreds of pieces of steel, riveted together, designed to turn you into a human tank, but with all the maneuverability of one. Imagine dressing for battle. It wasn't a quick hop into a bulletproof vest. It was a painstaking, multi-layered process that could take an hour or more, often requiring the help of several squires. First, your padded undershirt, then the mail coif, then the heavy chainmail hauberk, then the plate armor, pauldrons, vambraces, gauntlets, cuisses, greaves, and finally, the helmet. Each piece added weight, restricted movement, and made every breath an effort. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds, and that's without your shield and weapons. Try running a marathon in that, let alone fighting for your life. The heat inside that metal shell would be unbearable. Imagine fighting on a sunny day in the summer, encased in what essentially becomes a mobile oven. The metal would absorb the sun's heat, turning your armor into a convection chamber, quickly leading to dehydration and heat stroke. Ventilation was minimal, often just tiny slits for vision. The smell inside your helmet, after hours of sweat and exertion, would be an aroma truly unique to the medieval warrior. A pungent mix of unwashed hair, metal, and sheer effort. You can practically smell it now, can't you? It's not the scent of victory, but the aroma of utter misery. Furthermore, consider the practicality, or lack thereof, of wearing this armor for extended periods. You couldn't simply take a quick break, shed your armor, and relax. Once it was on, you were committed, going to the privy, or major logistical undertaking, eating. You might have to remove your helmet just to get food in your mouth, sleeping. Forget about it in full plate. You were either fighting, marching, or constantly preparing to do so, all while carrying this immense, suffocating burden. It transformed you, not just into a warrior, but into a walking, breathing, sweating, clanking monument to discomfort, the constant friction of metal on metal, the chafing against your skin, the pressure points. It would be an unending source of minor irritations that would build into a persistent ache. The phrase pain in the neck takes on a whole new meaning when you consider the literal strain of wearing a heavy helmet and gorget all day. This constant physical burden, even when not actively fighting, would drain your energy, erode your patience, and make even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Last night, we left off with the crushing weight of armor, the sheer physical and mental burden of a knight's everyday gear. Tonight, let's turn our attention from the weight on your back to the weight on your spirit, the constant, gnawing fear that would accompany you on campaign and in battle. Because while Hollywood shows valiant charges and clean sword fights, the reality of medieval warfare was a chaotic, brutal, and often horrifying mess, designed less for glory and more for sheer survival. You're imagining a strategic masterpiece, perhaps a chessboard of armies moving with precision. Instead, you're experiencing sensory overload. The air isn't filled with rousing bugle calls, but with the cacophony of 1,000 men, the thud of marching feet, the rattle of countless pieces of armor, and the nervous whinnies of horses. As you draw closer to the enemy, the sounds grow more intense, the distant shouts, the dull clang of steel on steel, the sickening thud of impact, and the smell, forget fresh mountain air. This is the scent of fear, of unwashed bodies, of horse sweat and manure, of damp earth and stale provisions. Once the battle truly begins, it's quickly joined by the coppery tang of blood and the acrid smell of smoke from torches or burning structures. Your senses are assaulted, overwhelming your ability to think clearly, leaving you reliant on instinct and your rigorous, often painful, training. The melee itself is not the graceful one-on-one duel you envision. It's a swirling, claustrophobic nightmare. You're packed in tight with your comrades, your vision often obscured by your helmet, by the dust kicked up, and by the sheer press of bodies. Your weapon, be it a sword, axe, or mace, feels clumsy and heavy in your tired hands. Every swing is a Herculean effort. You're not fighting a single opponent, you're fighting a dozen. A shield wall pushes against you. Spears jab from unexpected angles, and a blow could come from any direction. It's less about skill and more about brute force, endurance, and sheer luck. Historians still fiercely debate the true effectiveness of various medieval weapons in actual combat, often pointing out that many, like the longsword, were more about leverage and force than intricate parrying. And then there's the very real, very present danger. Every single moment is a dance with death. An arrow could find the gap in your armor, a spear could pierce your side, or a mace could crush your skull. There's no respawn button here. Injuries are horrific. A sword blow isn't a clean cut. It's a hacking, tearing wound that could sever a limb, split a bone, or leave you bleeding out in the mud. A blunt weapon strike could shatter bones, cause massive internal bleeding, or leave you with a concussion that would eventually lead to your demise. Even if you survived the immediate blow, imagine the pain. There's no morphine, no quick-acting pain relief. You're enduring agonizing pain, often for hours, maybe days, before you succumb or begin a slow, agonizing recovery. Beyond the physical wounds, consider the psychological scars. You're witnessing unspeakable horrors. Your comrades, friends you've trained and eaten with, fall around you, their lives extinguished in an instant, often with a grotesque finality. You see the fear in your enemy's eyes, and you feel the raw, primal urge to survive. The violence isn't abstract, it's intensely personal. You're looking into the eyes of the man you're trying to kill, or the man who's trying to kill you. The emotional toll of constantly living on the knife edge of life and death, of witnessing such brutality, would be immense. Post-traumatic stress was undoubtedly rampant, though completely unacknowledged and untreated. You wouldn't talk about it. You'd just endure it, letting the trauma fester beneath the surface, shaping your personality and your worldview. And what about the aftermath of battle? It's not simply a matter of packing up and going home. The battlefield is a gruesome tableau, dead and dying men littering the ground, their cries for help echoing in the sudden silence. The wounded who survive are often left to their fate, unless they are valuable enough for ransom. Imagine searching through the carnage for your friends, hoping they are alive, fearing what you will find. The stench of death quickly permeates the air, attracting scavengers both human and animal. You're likely tasked with helping to strip the dead for anything valuable: armor, weapons, clothing. A grim, dehumanizing task that further blurs the lines between warrior and ghoul. This wasn't about respecting the fallen, it was about practicality and survival. But the physical risks extend beyond the battlefield. Even when not fighting, your life is precarious. Travel itself is fraught with danger. Roads are often poorly maintained, infested with bandits, or simply non existent. A journey that would take you a few hours by car today could take weeks, exposing you to harsh weather, hunger, and opportunistic raiders. Your horse, while vital, is also a constant concern. A lame horse could leave you stranded, vulnerable. The very wilderness is a threat, filled with wild animals and the possibility of getting lost. You are never truly safe, never truly at ease. And let's not forget the strategic, yet often ignoble aspect of medieval warfare, the siege. Imagine being stuck outside a fortified castle for months on end, exposed to the elements, eating dwindling rations, and enduring the constant threat of sorties from the defenders. You're not engaged in glorious combat, you're digging trenches, building siege engines, and waiting. It's a war of attrition, a test of wills, and often a breeding ground for disease. Your camp would be a miserable place, crowded, unsanitary, and filled with the constant anxiety of a potential attack. Or, worse yet, imagine being on the inside of a besieged castle. You're trapped, slowly starving, watching your comrades succumb to hunger, thirst, or disease, all while hoping for a relief force that may never come. The psychological torment of knowing your fate is sealed, slowly wasting away, would be a special kind of hell. Beyond the actual fighting, the economics of being a knight were incredibly precarious. You might imagine them as wealthy lords, but many were not. Many knights were essentially mercenaries or retainers, serving a lord in exchange for land, a stipend, or simply the promise of plunder. Your income was irregular and entirely dependent on the success of your lord's ventures. If he lost a war or fell out of favor, your livelihood could vanish overnight. You might own a small parcel of land, but it would be constantly vulnerable to raids, crop failures, or the demands of your overlord. A knight's life was a constant financial tightrope walk, where glory could quickly turn into crippling debt, forcing you to sell off your meager possessions or even resort to banditry to survive. There were no savings accounts, no pensions, no unemployment benefits. Your security was tied directly to your ability to fight and to the fortunes of your liege. And the concept of honor, while central to the knightly ideal, its practical application was often flexible. You might be honor bound to your lord, but that lord might command you to commit acts that you, by your own code, found reprehensible. Do you refuse and risk losing everything, becoming an outcast, or do you follow orders, compromising your ideals for survival? This moral dilemma was a constant companion for many knights. Loyalty was a complex web, often shifting with political winds, marriages, and betrayals. You might be sworn to one lord, but that lord might have his own feuds and alliances, forcing you into conflicts you had no personal stake in, or even against former comrades. The political landscape was a treacherous minefield, where oaths could be broken as easily as they were made, and your word was only as good as your lord's power to enforce it. The notion of unwavering, principled loyalty, so often romanticized, was a luxury few could afford in the brutal game of medieval power. Last night, we peered into the chaotic brutality of medieval combat and the fragile finances of knighthood. Tonight, let's explore another layer of medieval discomfort, the constant struggle against the very environment they inhabited, and the almost unimaginable lack of personal space and privacy. Because while you might dream of a solitary, heroic knight riding through vast, unspoiled landscapes, the reality was often one of cramped living, pervasive odors, and a distinct lack of personal boundaries. Imagine for a moment, not the grand halls of a castle, but the crammed quarters of a campaign tent. You're on the march, Far from any permanent dwelling, living out of what amounts to a canvas bag. Your room is a shared space, packed with other warriors, their weapons, their unwashed bodies, and the lingering sense of campfires and horseflesh. Personal space is a luxury you simply cannot afford. You eat, sleep, and likely perform what passes for personal hygiene, all within arm's reach of your comrades. There's no escaping the snoring, the restless movements, or the constant low hum of conversation. The concept of privacy, of a moment alone to collect your thoughts, is practically alien. You are always part of a collective, a unit, and your personal needs are always secondary to the group's function. And the weather? You can romanticize the idea of rugged nights enduring the elements, but the reality was often miserable. Medieval clothing, made primarily of wool and linen, offered some protection, but it was far from waterproof or truly insulating against bitter cold. Imagine riding for days in torrential rain, your clothes becoming heavy, sodden burdens, chafing your skin and chilling you to the bone. Or picture yourself trying to sleep in a damp, freezing tent, your breath condensing in the air, your muscles aching from the cold. Conversely, summer campaigns brought their own miseries, searing heat, dust that coated everything, and the constant threat of dehydration. Sunstroke was a real danger, as was frostbite in winter. You were constantly at the mercy of Mother Nature, with very few ways to effectively mitigate her harsher moods. There was no Gore-Tex, no central heating, no air conditioning, just layers of scratchy fabric and the dubious comfort of a smoky fire. Then there's the travel itself. We touched on it briefly, but it deserves a deeper dive into its sheer unpleasantness. Journeys were not swift or comfortable. You would spend days, weeks, or even months on horseback, traversing rough terrain. Your saddle, while perhaps padded, would offer little real comfort over long distances, leading to saddle sores and a perpetually aching backside. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, easily washed out by rain, or choked with dust in dry weather. Bridges were rare, meaning you'd often have to ford rivers, a dangerous undertaking for both horse and rider, especially if the water was high or the current strong. Getting stuck in mud was a common occurrence, requiring exhausting effort to free yourself and your horse. And let's not forget the logistical nightmare of moving an army. If you were part of a larger force, imagine the sheer scale of the operation: thousands of men, horses, carts, and camp followers, all moving at the pace of the slowest element. Finding sufficient food and water for such a host was a monumental task, often necessitating foraging or outright plundering from the local populace, which, as you can imagine, did not endear you to them. The slow, arduous pace of travel meant that campaigns often dragged on, consuming precious resources and leaving you vulnerable to ambush or disease. You'd spend more time marching than fighting, and the marching itself was a grueling, monotonous ordeal. Consider the pervasive presence of animals. While your trusty steed was essential, it also came with its own set of challenges. Horses needed constant care, feeding, and grooming. They were prone to injury and disease, and losing your mount could cripple your effectiveness and even your ability to escape danger. And then there were the less helpful animals, rats and mice infesting every dwelling, fleas and lice making a home in your hair and clothes, and flies buzzing around every bit of food and waste. Animal waste was everywhere, contributing to the overall stench of medieval life and acting as a vector for disease. You were living in an ecosystem that was far more integrated with the natural world, for better or worse, and often it was for worse. The lack of advanced technology permeated every aspect of life. Simple tasks that we take for granted were immense undertakings. Want light after dark. You rely on candles, rushes dipped in fat, or smoky oil lamps, all providing dim, flickering illumination that barely pushes back the encroaching darkness. Reading by such light was difficult, if not impossible. One to cook. It's an open fire, prone to smoke and requiring constant tending. One to build something. It's manual labor, hand tools, and brute strength. The sheer physical effort required for everyday living, even for a night with servants, was far greater than anything you experience today. Your body would be constantly working, constantly under strain, leading to chronic aches and pains that no modern painkiller could touch. And the mental landscape was equally challenging. Your worldview was limited, formal education was rare, even for knights, often focusing on martial skills rather than academic pursuits. Your understanding of science, medicine, and the wider world was based on superstition, religious doctrine, and hearsay. The universe was a mysterious, often terrifying place, filled with omens, spirits, and the constant threat of divine wrath. You might believe in dragons, witches, or malevolent spirits, and these beliefs would shape your actions and your fears. The sheer power of the church permeated every aspect of life, dictating moral codes, offering comfort, but also instilling fear of eternal damnation. This wasn't a world where critical thinking and scientific inquiry were encouraged. It was a world of faith and fear, where questioning authority could lead to severe consequences. Think about the limited forms of entertainment. After a long, grueling day, what did you do to unwind? There were no books for pleasure reading, no music on demand, no screens to distract you. You might gather around a fire, listening to stories, singing crude songs, or playing simple games of chance. The concept of leisure was inextricably linked with practical activities or religious observances. You might attend a feast, if one was held, or watch a joust. But these were intermittent events. The daily rhythm was one of work, prayer, and sleep, punctuated by moments of intense physical exertion or fear. The psychological impact of such a limited existence, without the constant stimulation of modern life, would be profound. It would shape your perception of time, making it feel slower, more deliberate, and perhaps more monotonous. The absence of stimulating distractions would force you to confront your own thoughts, your fears, and your limited understanding of the world, leading to a kind of introspective solitude that few modern individuals experience. Historians argue about how prevalent boredom truly was in medieval life, given the demands of survival, but the lack of diverse stimuli undoubtedly played a role in mental well-being. Finally, consider the very structure of medieval society, the feudal system. You, as a knight, were a cog in a much larger machine, bound by oaths and obligations to your lord, who in turn was bound to his overlord, and so on, all the way up to the king. Your freedom was limited. You couldn't just pack up and leave if you didn't like your situation. Your land, your title, your very identity was tied to your service. Disobedience could mean forfeiture, disgrace, or worse. You were constantly performing duties, collecting taxes, managing peasants, and maintaining order on your lord's behalf. It was a life of perpetual obligation, where your personal desires often took a backseat to the demands of your station and the rigid hierarchy of power. The idea of upward mobility, of changing your destiny, was largely a foreign concept. You were born into your role, and that role largely defined your entire existence, leaving little room for individual ambition or self-determination. Last night, we considered the environmental challenges and the sheer lack of personal space a medieval knight faced. Tonight, let's peel back another layer of that romanticized image and talk about something truly fundamental to their identity, their weapons, and the very act of killing. Because the sword, in the stone, the mace that fells giants. These are instruments of brutal efficiency, and wielding them came with a cost far beyond the material. You might envision yourself as a knight, with a perfectly balanced, gleaming broadsword, ready to parry and thrust with elegant precision. The reality of medieval weaponry was far less refined. Your sword, while a symbol of your status, was often a heavy, utilitarian tool, designed to hack and cleave through bone and sinew rather than dance in a fencing match. Swords could weigh anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds, which might not sound like much, but try swinging that repeatedly for minutes on end in the heat of battle, especially while encumbered by armor and fighting for your life. Fatigue would set in rapidly, making every swing a monumental effort. And swords weren't even always the most effective weapon. For sheer brutal efficiency against armored opponents, the mace, the axe, or even the hammer often reigned supreme. These blunt instruments, designed to crush and smash rather than cut, were terrifyingly effective at transferring kinetic energy directly to the body, even through mail or plate. Imagine the sickening crunch of bone, the internal damage, the concussions that would inevitably result from such blows. This wasn't about a clean, dramatic thrust. It was about overwhelming force, about incapacitating your opponent with brutal efficiency. The visual of a knight with a shining sword is iconic, but the reality was often a knight wielding a weapon designed for pure, unadulterated demolition. This is why historians often refer to medieval combat as blunt force trauma in a box. Now, let's talk about that moment of impact, the act of killing itself. Hollywood often sanitizes death, making it quick, clean, and often bloodless. The reality of medieval combat was anything but. When you struck an enemy, it wasn't just a dramatic clang of steel. It was the sickening thud of metal against bone, the tearing of flesh, the spray of blood, and the visceral sound of a human life ending. You weren't fighting anonymous figures. You were fighting men who looked you in the eye, whose desperate struggles were palpable. The fear, the pain, the desperation, it would all be right there, in front of you, intensely personal and deeply unsettling. You'd be surrounded by the dying. Imagine their screams, their gurgles, their cries for mercy or for God. The battlefield was a slaughterhouse, a gruesome tableau of mangled bodies, dismembered limbs, and rivers of blood. The sheer noise of combat, the clashing of weapons, the shouts, the groans, the terrified whinnies of horses would be deafening, disorienting, and psychologically scarring. There was no escaping it, no way to filter out the horror. You were immersed in it, part of it, and actively contributing to it. This level of sustained close-quarters violence would leave an indelible mark on your psyche, turning dreams into nightmares and leaving you perpetually on edge. And what about the sheer physical toll? Combat was an exhausting, brutal aerobic exercise. In your heavy armor, swinging a weapon for minutes on end would push your body to its absolute limits. Your heart would be pounding, your lungs burning, sweat pouring down your face and body. Dehydration was a constant threat, and the risk of collapse from sheer exhaustion was very real. You weren't just fighting an enemy, you were fighting your own body, pushing it beyond what it was designed to endure. A knight, even a highly trained one, would be utterly spent after even a short engagement, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack or simply to the elements. Beyond pitched battles, there was the less glamorous, but equally dangerous, work of raiding and skirmishes. This wasn't always about grand strategy. It was often about intimidation, plunder, and asserting dominance over rival territories. You might find yourself burning a peasant's home, stealing their livestock, or even engaging in the grim practice of taking non-combatants as hostages for ransom. These acts, while pragmatic in the brutal calculus of medieval power, would weigh heavily on the conscience of any man not entirely devoid of empathy. The lines between honorable combatant and brutal raider often blurred, forcing you to participate in actions that might contradict the very chivalric code you swore to uphold. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of betrayal. A battle wasn't just about fighting the enemy in front of you. It was also about trusting the men beside you. A moment of hesitation, a lapse in formation, or an act of cowardice from a comrade could mean your death. You had to implicitly trust your shield brothers, knowing that their failure could be your undoing. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if a lord's allies suddenly switched sides in the middle of a battle, leaving you exposed? The shifting allegiances and political machinations we discussed previously weren't just confined to court. They could have immediate, fatal consequences on the battlefield. You were constantly aware that your life depended not just on your own skill, but on the loyalty and competence of those around you. Furthermore, medieval warfare didn't always involve grand armies. Often, it was small-scale raiding, ambushes, and constant skirmishes. You might spend weeks patrolling contested borders, never knowing when an enemy band might appear from the woods. This perpetual state of low-level conflict, this constant vigilance, would be mentally exhausting. You couldn't relax, couldn't let your guard down. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every distant sound might signal an approaching threat. The stress of this constant readiness, the unending anxiety, would erode your mental well-being over time, leading to a state of perpetual hyper-alertness that would make true rest impossible. Sleep, when it came, would be fitful and uneasy, haunted by the specter of what tomorrow might bring. This is why historians suggest that many knights likely suffered from chronic anxiety and even paranoia, a direct consequence of their dangerous profession. Consider also the primitive medical care available for injuries. If you survived a battle wound, your troubles were far from over. A simple broken bone could lead to debilitating pain and permanent disfigurement if not set properly. A deep cut could fester, leading to gangrene and amputation, often without anesthetic, or even death by infection. There were no sterile instruments, no understanding of antiseptics, and limited knowledge of anatomy. The doctors were often barbers or apothecaries, whose remedies ranged from the mildly ineffective to the downright dangerous. You would likely endure excruciating pain during any procedure, and your chances of full recovery were slim. Many knights who survived battle were left with chronic pain, limps, missing limbs, or other permanent disabilities that would severely impact their quality of life. The gleaming knight of legend often ended his days as a broken, scarred veteran, a testament to the brutal toll of his chosen profession. And finally, let's reflect on the moral compromises. The chivalric code, as we've noted, was often more aspirational than practical. You, as a knight, were often ordered to perform acts that ran counter to the ideals of honor and justice, pillaging towns, executing prisoners, participating in scorched earth tactics. These were realities of medieval warfare. You might rationalize them as necessities of war, as orders from your lord. But the cumulative effect of participating in such act would undoubtedly chip away at your soul. Could you truly consider yourself a noble knight after witnessing or participating in such atrocities? The cognitive dissonance, the struggle between your idealized role and the grim realities of your actions, would be a profound internal conflict. This wasn't about righteous battles. It was often about survival, power, and the grim calculus of medieval conflict, leaving a legacy of both physical and moral scars. Last night, we delved into the brutal reality of medieval combat and the physical and psychological toll of wielding lethal weapons. Tonight, let's explore another often overlooked aspect of a knight's life, The intricate, often treacherous, web of loyalty, politics, and the relentless pursuit of power that defined their existence far more than any romanticized notions of chivalry. Because while you might picture unwavering fealty and clear lines of command, the medieval world was a murky, shifting landscape where allegiances could turn on a dime. You imagine a knight? Perhaps Sir Gareth, pledging his sword to a noble king, his loyalty as steadfast as the stone walls of a fortress. The truth, however, was rarely so simple. Feudalism, the system that governed medieval society, was built on a pyramid of oaths and obligations. You, as a knight, swore fealty to a lord. That lord, in turn, owed fealty to a greater lord, who might then owe fealty to a duke, and eventually to the king. But here's the kicker. These oaths were often personal, not institutional. When a lord died, or if a new ruler came to power, those oaths might be renegotiated, challenged, or outright broken. Your own position, your land, and your very livelihood were constantly vulnerable to these shifts in the political landscape. Imagine being caught in a power struggle between two powerful lords, both of whom you might have sworn oaths to at different times, or whose interests suddenly diverged. Do you choose the lord who holds your lands, or the one who offers a greater promise of glory or riches? This wasn't a hypothetical exercise. It was a daily reality for many knights. The temptation of a better offer, the fear of reprisal, or the sheer pragmatism of backing the winning side often trumped any lofty ideals of unwavering loyalty. This is why historians often refer to medieval politics as a great game, a complex, ruthless, and ever-changing struggle for dominance where loyalty was often a currency, not an absolute. And then there's the specter of betrayal. It wasn't just a plot device in a historical drama. It was a constant, tangible threat. Your rivals at court might whisper poison in your lord's ear. A disgruntled vassal might conspire against you. Even your own family members might scheme to usurp your inheritance or influence. Paranoia wasn't a flaw. It was a survival mechanism. You had to be constantly vigilant, reading subtle cues, interpreting rumors, and assessing the intentions of everyone around you. Trust was a rare and precious commodity, easily shattered, and almost impossible to rebuild. This constant state of suspicion, the need to anticipate every possible move, would be incredibly draining, leading to a life lived perpetually on edge. Consider the role of marriage and inheritance in this political game. As a knight, you might not have had the luxury of marrying for love. Your marriage would likely be a strategic alliance, arranged by your lord or your family to secure lands, consolidate power, or forge crucial alliances. Your spouse might be a stranger, perhaps from a rival family, and your union a cold, calculated transaction. The children produced from this union were often seen less as beloved offspring and more as future assets, pawns in the ongoing struggle for dynastic power. The emotional toll of such a life, where personal desires were sacrificed for political expediency, would be immense. Your home, far from being a sanctuary, could be another battlefield of subtle intrigues and unspoken resentments. Even in peacetime, your life was largely dictated by the whims and ambitions of your lord. You might spend months or years simply residing at his castle, performing routine duties, attending his court, and participating in his hunts. Your time was not your own, it was his. If he decided to embark on a distant campaign, you went. If he demanded your presence at a tedious court function, you attended. There was little room for personal autonomy or the pursuit of individual interests. Your identity was inextricably linked to your service, and your future hinged entirely on your lord's fortunes and his continued favor. This dependence could feel stifling, a gilded cage for a warrior whose true purpose lay on the battlefield. The legal system. such as it was, also contributed to this precarious existence. There were no clearly defined laws or universal justice systems as we know them today. Justice was often dispensed by your lord or by local custom, and it could be arbitrary, influenced by power, wealth, or personal vendettas. If you were accused of a crime, your fate might depend more on your lord's mood or his relationship with your accuser than on any objective evidence. Trial by ordeal or trial by combat, while romanticized, were brutal and often fatal ways to determine guilt or innocence. Imagine facing an accusation, knowing that your only recourse might be to fight a duel to the death or to walk across hot coals, hoping for divine intervention. It was a terrifying gamble where your life and honor could be lost on a whim. This lack of a reliable, impartial justice system meant that every disagreement could escalate into violence, and every accusation carried the weight of potentially life altering consequences. Moreover, the economic landscape was inherently unstable. Beyond the personal finances we discussed, the wider economy was fragile. Agricultural yields were dependent on the weather, trade routes were vulnerable to banditry and war, and widespread disease could cripple entire regions. As a knight, your wealth was primarily tied to land, and the value of that land could plummet due to famine, plague, or invasion. There was no diversified portfolio, no stock market to cushion the blow. A bad harvest could mean widespread hunger for your tenants, impacting your own income and leading to unrest. This constant economic vulnerability added another layer of anxiety to an already stressful existence. You might be a landholder, but you were never truly secure, always one catastrophe away from ruin. Consider the pressure to maintain your image and reputation. In a society where honor and status were paramount, any perceived slight or act of cowardice could destroy your standing. Your worth as a knight wasn't just measured by your prowess in battle, but also by your adherence to a complex, often contradictory code of conduct. A public insult could necessitate a duel to defend your honor, even if you knew it was a foolish risk. Maintaining a retinue, participating in tournaments, and hosting lavish feasts were all part of projecting an image of power and prosperity, even if it meant stretching your finances to their breaking point. This constant performance, this need to appear strong and honorable, would be mentally exhausting, forcing you to suppress your true feelings and present a carefully curated persona to the world. Finally, think about the limited lifespan and the lack of a secure future. As we discussed, life was short and often brutal. But beyond the physical dangers, there was little sense of long-term planning or security. You wouldn't be saving for retirement, investing for future generations, or even truly expecting to live to a ripe old age. Your life was about the here and now, about surviving the next battle, the next winter, the next political intrigue. The concept of a comfortable, peaceful retirement was a fantasy for all but the very luckiest. Many knights, if they survived to old age, would find themselves infirm, scarred, and often with diminished resources, a living testament to the harsh realities of their profession. This pervasive sense of precarity, the understanding that your existence was fragile and your future uncertain, would undoubtedly shape your worldview, making even small comforts feel fleeting and every moment of peace a temporary reprieve from the inevitable struggles ahead. It's a stark contrast to our modern obsession with planning and securing a future, a mindset that simply didn't exist for most medieval knights. Last night, we explored the shifting sands of medieval loyalty and the constant political maneuvering that defined a knight's existence. Tonight, let's delve into another fundamental truth often glossed over in romantic tales: the pervasive lack of comfort and the truly primitive nature of medieval living conditions. Because while you might picture knights enjoying grand castle life, the reality was often cold, damp, smelly, and far from luxurious. Imagine stepping into your home as a knight. If you were lucky, it might be a small stone manor or a designated chamber within a larger castle. But don't picture central heating, running water, or even proper ventilation. Castles, while imposing from the outside, were notoriously drafty, damp, and cold in the winter months. The thick stone walls, designed for defense, absorbed and radiated cold, making even indoor spaces feel perpetually chilled. Heating came primarily from open hearths, which did more to fill the room with smoke and soot than to provide consistent warmth. Your eyes would constantly sting, and your lungs would ache from the perpetual haze and the smells. Oh, the smells! Without modern sanitation, indoor plumbing, or regular bathing, medieval life was a symphony of pungent odors. You'd contend with the smell of wood smoke, stale food, unwashed bodies, animal waste from the stables nearby, and the lingering scent of unemptied chamber pots. Privacy for bodily functions was a luxury almost unheard of. A privy was often just a hole in the wall or floor, emptying directly into the moat or a cesspit below. The pervasive stench would be a constant, assaulting presence, something your modern nose would find almost unbearable. Then there's the issue of personal hygiene, or the severe lack thereof. The idea of a daily shower or even regular hand washing was completely alien. Baths were rare events, perhaps a few times a year, in large tubs of laboriously heated water, often shared among several individuals. Soap, if available, was harsh and crude. Your clothes, typically made of wool or linen, were rarely washed and would accumulate layers of grime, sweat, and body odor. You'd be constantly scratching at fleas and lice, which were ubiquitous companions in medieval life. Imagine trying to sleep soundly when your scalp and body are constantly itching from unseen inhabitants. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It contributed directly to the spread of disease, as we discussed previously. Let's talk about food storage and preparation. Forget refrigerators or sealed containers. Food was preserved through salting, smoking, pickling, or drying. This meant much of your diet was tough, bland, and often heavily salted. Fresh produce was only available seasonally and for a short window. Meat, even after preparation, was often infested with maggots or spoiled quickly if not consumed. Cooking was done over open fires, with all the associated smoke and risk of burns. Food safety standards were non existent, making food poisoning a regular, unpleasant occurrence, often dismissed as the flux or a mild sickness. You'd eat what was available, when it was available, and often with a quiet prayer that it wouldn't make you violently ill. And what about sleep? In a world without comfortable mattresses, climate control, or soundproofing, a good night's rest would be a rare blessing. Your bed might be a straw mattress, shared with others, and constantly host to various creepy crawlies. The castle was never truly silent guards on patrol. The sounds of animals, the creaks and groans of the ancient structure, and the ever-present drafts would constantly disturb your slumber. Forget the tranquility of a silent, darkened room. You'd be sleeping in an environment that was often cold, noisy, and potentially itchy. The cumulative effect of chronic sleep deprivation would wear down your physical and mental resilience, making you irritable, less alert, and more susceptible to illness and injury. Historians generally agree that consistent, uninterrupted sleep was a luxury for very few in the medieval period. Beyond the castle walls, when on campaign, the conditions were even worse. You would be sleeping on the cold, damp ground, often in the open or in a flimsy tent, exposed to the elements and the constant threat of attack. Your rest would be broken by guard duty, the sounds of the camp, and the gnawing anxiety of battle to come. There was no comfortable cot, no sleeping bag, just your cloak and perhaps a thin blanket against the cold earth. The restorative power of deep sleep, so crucial for a warrior, was often denied to you. Consider the pain. In a world without effective painkillers, even minor injuries or chronic conditions would be a constant source of discomfort. Arthritis, toothaches, joint pain from strenuous activity, or lingering wounds from past battles. These would be your constant companions. You'd simply have to endure them, gritting your teeth and pushing through the pain. There was no over the counter ibuprofen or a quick trip to the dentist. Pain was simply a part of life, a constant backdrop to your existence. This stoicism wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The lack of privacy extended beyond shared sleeping quarters. Every aspect of your life was largely public. Your interactions with your lord, your training, your meals, they all took place in communal spaces, under the watchful eyes of others. There was little opportunity for solitude, for quiet contemplation, or for simply being yourself without judgment. This constant surveillance, this lack of a true private sphere, could be incredibly draining, forcing you to maintain a facade and never truly relax. Finally, think about the limited lifespan and the pervasive presence of death. Death wasn't an abstract concept, it was a constant, tangible reality. You would witness it frequently, not just in battle, but from disease, childbirth, accidents, and starvation. Life expectancy was brutally short, often in the 30s or 40s, even for nobles. You would bury loved ones, children, spouses, comrades, with a regularity that would be shocking by modern standards. This constant exposure to mortality would undoubtedly shape your worldview, perhaps making you more fatalistic, more religious, or simply more focused on the present moment, knowing that tomorrow was never guaranteed. This omnipresent specter of death, coupled with the lack of comfort and constant hardship, painted a grim picture of a knight's daily existence, stripping away any romantic notions of their celebrated status. The simple act of surviving, day to day, was a triumph in itself. Last night, we explored the cold, damp, and decidedly uncomfortable realities of medieval living and the constant battle against grime and disease. Tonight, let's consider a crucial aspect of a knight's life that often gets overlooked: the absolute monotony and boredom that filled the vast stretches between moments of intense combat or political intrigue. Because while you might imagine a life of constant adventure, the truth was often an agonizingly slow grind of waiting, training, and enduring. You're not always charging into battle, leading a heroic siege, or jousting for honor. For long periods, a knight's life was dictated by routine, often dull, and repetitive duties. If you were a landed knight, you were responsible for the day-to-day management of your estate. This meant endless administrative tasks, overseeing the harvest, settling minor disputes among your peasants, inspecting your meager fortifications, or ensuring your tenants paid their rents, which were often paid in grain, livestock, or labor, requiring constant accounting and oversight. Imagine the sheer tedium of balancing crude ledgers or riding out to ensure a peasant wasn't holding back too much of his harvest. This was far from the romantic ideal of a warrior. And then there's the training. While essential for combat readiness, it was an incredibly repetitive and physically demanding grind. Hour after hour, you'd practice with your sword, your shield, your lance, enduring the same motions, day in and day out. There were no varied exercises, no complex gym routines, just the same drills, endlessly repeated. This wasn't about personal bests or fitness goals. It was about muscle memory, about developing the endurance to survive a chaotic fight. Imagine the blisters, the aching muscles, the sheer exhaustion, all compounded by the knowledge that tomorrow you'd do it all again and again and again. Consider the slow pace of life and communication. News traveled at the speed of a horse or slower. A message from the king could take weeks to reach you. Orders from your lord might be outdated by the time they arrived. There was no instant gratification, no quick access to information, no way to stave off boredom with a scroll through social media. You lived in a world of profound slowness, where waiting was an inherent part of existence. Waiting for news, waiting for orders, waiting for the seasons to change, waiting for the next meal. This forced patience, this constant state of anticipation without immediate resolution, would be incredibly taxing for a modern mind accustomed to instant updates. And what about entertainment? As we've briefly touched upon, the options were incredibly limited. Feasts and tournaments were rare. Special events. On a typical evening, after a long day of duties or training, your options for recreation were rudimentary. You might listen to a minstrel if one happened to be passing through, or engage in simple games like dice or an early form of chess. Storytelling was a primary form of entertainment, but even those tales would become familiar over time. The lack of diverse stimuli, of engaging forms of escapism, would leave you with ample time for your thoughts to wander, often towards the harsh realities of your precarious life. The psychological burden of constant boredom, coupled with perpetual anxiety, would undoubtedly contribute to a low level, simmering discontent. Beyond these personal aspects, the isolation of medieval life was profound. While you might be surrounded by your lord's retinue or your own family, your world was geographically small. Travel was dangerous and expensive, meaning most people rarely ventured beyond their immediate region. Your understanding of the world was limited to what you experienced firsthand or heard through often exaggerated rumors. There was no concept of a global community, no easy way to connect with distant lands or cultures. This isolation could lead to a narrow worldview, fostering suspicion of outsiders and reinforcing rigid social hierarchies. Your life was lived within very defined, often claustrophobic, boundaries. Think about the limited opportunities for personal advancement or change. You were born into your station. If you were a knight, your path was largely set. There was very little social mobility. You couldn't simply decide to change careers, move to a new city for a better job, or pursue a hobby that might lead to a different life. Your identity, your purpose, and your future were largely predetermined by your birth and your service. This lack of agency, this feeling of being trapped by circumstance, would be incredibly frustrating for someone with modern sensibilities. The aspirations you might hold would be constantly constrained by the rigid social structure and the expectations of your lord. And then there's the lack of intellectual stimulation. While some knights might have been literate, many were not, and formal education was rare, focusing primarily on martial skills and religious instruction. There were no scientific journals, no philosophical treatises for casual reading, no debates about complex ideas. Your worldview was largely shaped by religious dogma and ancient traditions. Questioning authority or seeking knowledge outside established norms could be dangerous, seen as heresy or rebellion. This intellectual stagnation, this lack of opportunity for critical thought and exploration, would be stifling for a curious mind, leaving a profound sense of untapped potential and unasked questions. Historians often debate the true level of medieval literacy and its impact, but it's clear the intellectual landscape was vastly different from our own. Finally, consider the constant vulnerability to external forces beyond your control. A bad harvest could lead to famine, impacting your tenants and your own wealth. A sudden outbreak of plague could decimate your lands and your household. A change in the king's favor could see your lands confiscated and your title revoked. There was no real insurance, no government safety nets, no way to truly protect yourself from the whims of nature or the machinations of power. You lived in a constant state of precarity, always aware that your carefully constructed life could be shattered in an instant by forces entirely beyond your control. This pervasive sense of helplessness, the knowledge that your destiny was so often in the hands of fate, would be a heavy burden to carry, making even the periods of peace feel like a fragile illusion. It's a fundamental difference from our modern world, where we often feel a greater sense of control over our lives and futures. A stark reminder that the glory of knighthood came with an almost unbearable price of perpetual anxiety and profound limitations. Last night, we explored the crushing monotony and profound limitations of a knight's existence, far from the ceaseless adventure typically imagined. Tonight, let's peel back another layer of the romantic illusion and talk about the knight's perceived image versus the often grim, even desperate, economic realities and the constant shadow of debt or ruin that haunted many. Because while you might picture coffers overflowing with gold, the truth was often a precarious tightrope walk. You imagine a knight, perhaps Sir Reginald the Rich, living in lavish comfort, his wealth stemming from vast lands and successful campaigns. The reality for most knights, however, was a constant struggle to maintain their status without going bankrupt. Being a knight was an incredibly expensive endeavor. Just acquiring the basic equipment, armor, weapons, a war horse, could cost as much as a small farm or an entire village's annual income. This wasn't a one-time purchase either. Armor needed constant maintenance, repairs, and eventual replacement. Weapons dulled, broke, or were lost. Horses needed to be fed, stabled, and replaced if injured or killed. These were enormous recurring expenses that perpetually drained a knight's resources. And then there was the cost of maintaining your retinue. As a knight of any standing, you were expected to have squires, pages, and perhaps a handful of men at arms. These individuals needed to be fed, housed, and equipped. While they provided essential service, they were also a constant drain on your finances. You couldn't simply let them go when times were tough. Your reputation, your military effectiveness, and your very safety depended on their loyalty and presence. Imagine trying to balance a budget where your primary assets were land that could be ravaged by war or famine, and your main expenses were iron, steel, and a small standing army. There were no venture capitalists, no low-interest loans, and no diverse stock portfolios to fall back on. Consider the concept of ransom. In medieval warfare, capturing a high-ranking knight or noble could be far more lucrative than killing them. You might envision this as a glorious act, but it was a cold, calculated business transaction. If you were captured, your family or lord would have to pay a substantial sum for your release. This could bankrupt your family, forcing them to sell off lands, jewels, or even take out crippling loans from moneylenders. Conversely, if you captured an enemy, you became responsible for their upkeep while awaiting ransom, adding another layer of expense and logistical challenge. It was a high-stakes gamble where your life and the financial well-being of your entire lineage hung in the balance. Historians often emphasize the economic incentive behind capturing, rather than killing, opponents on the battlefield, making it less about chivalry and more about cold, hard cash. And what if you lost your lands or your lord's favor? Many knights were granted lands or stipends as payment for their service. This wasn't outright ownership as we understand it, but a form of conditional tenure. If your lord died without an heir, or if you fell out of his favor, or if your lands were conquered by an enemy, you could lose everything overnight. There was no social safety net, no unemployment benefits, no government assistance. You would be utterly destitute, forced to become a mercenary, a bandit, or to beg for patronage from another lord, always at the mercy of their generosity. This constant vulnerability, this knowledge that your entire livelihood could vanish with a single stroke of bad luck or political maneuvering, would be a relentless source of anxiety. Let's also talk about the economy itself. Medieval economies were predominantly agrarian, meaning wealth was directly tied to the land and its productivity. Crop failures due to bad weather, disease affecting livestock, or widespread famine could cripple a region, impacting your income and the ability of your peasants to pay their dues. Trade, while existing, was far more limited and risky than today, vulnerable to piracy, banditry, and the whims of local rulers. There were no stable, centralized financial markets, and currency could be debased, leading to inflation. This inherent instability meant that even a seemingly wealthy knight was always just one bad harvest or one lost war away from severe financial distress. And the cost of war itself, while war could, in theory, lead to plunder and new lands, it was also incredibly destructive and expensive. Campaigns required vast amounts of resources, food, supplies, weapons, and the wages for any mercenaries. Sieges could drag on for months, draining coffers. Lands ravaged by war produced no income. A protracted conflict, even a victorious one, could leave you and your lord financially exhausted, facing years of debt and reconstruction. You might win the battle, but lose your financial solvency. This paradox meant that the very act that defined a knight's purpose could also be the source of his ultimate ruin. Consider the pressure to maintain appearances. As a knight, you were a member of the nobility, and there was an expectation of living a certain lifestyle. This meant hosting guests, participating in tournaments, contributing to religious institutions, and maintaining a certain level of dress and display. These social obligations, while seemingly minor, were incredibly costly. A lavish feast, a new suit of armor for a tournament, or a generous donation to the local church could quickly deplete your ready cash. You were caught in a trap pen to maintain your status, or risk losing respect and influence. This constant pressure to keep up appearances, even when your finances were stretched thin, would be another source of unending stress. Many knights likely lived a life of perpetual financial anxiety, always on the brink of overspending their limited resources. Finally, reflect on the stark class divisions that underpinned this economic reality. While you, as a knight, were privileged compared to the vast majority of peasants, your wealth was relative. You were utterly dependent on the labor of others, and your economic position was inherently tied to the rigid feudal hierarchy. There was no concept of a middle class as we understand it, no real opportunity to build wealth through entrepreneurship or innovation. Your economic fate was largely determined by your birth and your lord's fortunes. This lack of economic mobility and the constant vulnerability to external factors meant that even at the pinnacle of their social standing, medieval knights lived a life shadowed by the persistent threat of financial ruin, a far cry from the unburdened, glorious figures of legend. The weight of their steel was often matched, if not surpassed, by the weight of their precarious financial existence. Last night, we confronted the often unspoken financial anxieties that plagued medieval knights, a far cry from the image of boundless wealth. Tonight, we conclude our journey by looking at the inevitable decline of the knightly ideal itself, and how the very world that created them eventually left them behind. Because the age of the gleaming, individual warrior didn't last forever. It was eventually superseded by new technologies, new forms of warfare, and a changing social landscape. You've pictured the knight as an indispensable figure, the ultimate warrior, but their dominance was far from eternal. The very battlefield that defined their existence began to change in ways that minimized their individual effectiveness. The emergence of new infantry tactics, Particularly the disciplined use of longbows and crossbows proved devastatingly effective against even heavily armored knights. Imagine being a knight, clad in your expensive, cumbersome plate armor, charging across a field, only to be met by a hail of arrows capable of piercing your defenses, fired by commoners with years of dedicated training. This wasn't a noble duel, it was a rain of death from a distance, turning the battlefield into a shooting gallery where the armored knight became a prime target, not an unassailable force. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, where English longbowmen decimated French heavy cavalry, stands as a stark, bloody testament to this shift. Historians still debate the exact impact of these new weapons, but their psychological and physical effect on the perceived invincibility of the knight was undeniable. Then came the rise of gunpowder, cannons, initially crude and unreliable, slowly but surely began to dismantle the very foundations of the knight's power, the stone castle. A fortress that once required months, even years, to besiege with traditional methods could now be breached in days or weeks by sustained cannon fire. This rendered the knight's role as a castle defender less critical and shifted the balance of power away from individual strongholds towards larger, centrally controlled armies. And as handheld firearms, like the arquebus, became more prevalent, the advantage of plate armor diminished even further. A bullet, even a slow-moving one, could punch through steel that was designed to deflect a sword or arrow, making the heavy armor less of a shield and more of a target. You could spend a fortune on the finest plate, only for it to be rendered obsolete by a much cheaper, mass-produced projectile. Beyond military shifts, society itself was evolving. The rigid feudal system, which had placed knights at its heart, began to crack under various pressures. The growth of towns and cities, the rise of a merchant class with new forms of wealth, and the increasing power of centralized monarchies all challenged the traditional power base of the landed nobility. Wealth was no longer solely tied to land and military service. It could be accumulated through trade, banking, and commerce. This meant that the knight, once the primary embodiment of power and status, had to compete with new social classes for influence and prestige. The romantic ideal of chivalry, while still celebrated in literature, became increasingly out of step with the pragmatic realities of a changing world. The cost of maintaining the knightly lifestyle also became increasingly unsustainable. As we've discussed, armor and equipment were expensive, and the constant need for upkeep, retinues, and participation in expensive tournaments drained resources. As monarchies grew stronger, they began to rely more on standing armies composed of professional soldiers and mercenaries, who, while perhaps lacking the honor of a knight, were more disciplined, more reliably loyal to the crown, and often cheaper to maintain. The idea of every noble serving as a warrior became less practical and less necessary as professional armies took center stage. You, as a knight, might still be called upon, but your role was becoming increasingly specialized and, at times, peripheral to the main military force. Furthermore, the very cultural narrative began to shift. While tales of chivalry continued to be popular, there was a growing cynicism about the practical realities of knighthood. Authors and artists began to subtly critique or parody the knightly ideal, reflecting a changing public perception. The larger-than-life hero began to be seen, at times, as a figure of outdated tradition, perhaps even a bit of a relic. This gradual erosion of public perception, combined with the military and economic shifts, meant that the knight was slowly but surely losing his central, almost mythical place in society. The gleam was fading, replaced by a more pragmatic, less romantic view of warfare and social order. Imagine being a knight in this period of transition. You've been trained since childhood for a specific purpose, your entire identity wrapped up in a code of honor and martial prowess. But the world around you is moving on, rendering your skills and even your very existence increasingly less relevant. Your expensive armor is becoming a liability. Your battle strategies are being outmaneuvered by new technologies, and your social standing is being challenged by new forms of wealth and power. This sense of obsolescence, of being left behind by the relentless march of progress, would be incredibly disheartening. You might cling to the old ways, to the ideals of chivalry, but the winds of change would be undeniable, leaving you feeling like a dinosaur in a rapidly evolving world. In the end, the medieval knight didn't disappear overnight. Their role evolved, sometimes into courtly figures, sometimes into professional cavalry within larger armies. But the specific, independent, and almost sacred status of the individual knight, the figure we romanticize so readily, slowly faded. The practical, brutal realities of their lives, coupled with the inevitable advance of technology and social structures, conspired to relegate them to the annals of history, transforming them from a living force into a legend. The ideals of honor, courage, and loyalty continued, of course, but the vessel, the shining knight of popular imagination, became as relic, a fascinating, complex, and ultimately quite uncomfortable chapter in the long, messy story of human history. As the echoes of their clanking armor fade and the medieval castles crumble gently into ruins, we're left with the quiet whispers of a time that was far less glamorous than the stories would have you believe. It was a life of cold stone, rough cloth, questionable food, and omnipresent discomfort. A life where the weight of your armor was often less burdensome than the weight of your obligations, your anxieties, and the ever present threat of a brutal end. But perhaps, in understanding the true hardships, you gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience of those who lived through it. And maybe, just maybe, it makes your own warm, quiet bed feel a little bit more comfortable tonight.